Have you ever had a moment where what God promised and what you were experiencing felt like complete opposites? You read the promises in Scripture. You hear sermons about breakthrough, blessing, and God's faithfulness. But when you look around at your life, it feels like everything is falling apart. If you've ever felt that tension between what God said and what you see in Psalm 89 was written for you. Because Psalm 89 is not a neat, tidy chapter. It is a collision of praise and pain. It begins with worship and ends with questions. And yet, through it all, it reveals one of the most powerful truths in the entire Bible. God's covenant cannot break, even when life does. Today, we're going to walk through this psalm like a journey, from praise to promise to pain and back to praise again. And by the end, I believe your faith will come alive with new strength, new hope, and new confidence in the God who never lies. The God who is greater than creation. Psalm 89 verse 1 to 18. The psalm opens with a declaration of worship. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. With my mouth will I make known his faithfulness. Before the writer talks about problems, he talks about God. That's the posture of faith. That's the foundation of stability. He says, your faithfulness will be established in the heavens. Why the heavens? Because the heavens don't change. The stars don't panic. The moon doesn't break. God's faithfulness is anchored in something stronger than human emotion and stronger than earthly instability. Even when we waver, he remains steady. Then the psalmist describes God's power, the one who rules the raging sea. When the waves rise, he is the one who speaks peace. This isn't poetic language, this is a revelation. The storms that terrify you are still subject to his voice. The chaos that overwhelms you is still beneath his feet. And then the psalm says, blessed are the people who walk in the light of your countenance. When you walk in God's light, confusion loses its power. Darkness loses its influence. God's face gives clarity when life is unclear. That's the God we serve, faithful, steady, unshakable. The covenant God made with David, Psalm 89 verse 19 to 37. But then the psalmist turns from creation to covenant. He begins to recount one of the most important promises in all of Scripture, the covenant God made with David. God chose David. David didn't campaign for the throne. He didn't audition. He didn't strive. God picked him, anointed him, and promised protection, victory, and a throne established forever. And God said, I will not break my covenant, nor alter the words that have gone out of my lips. That is God's character. He does not break promises. He fulfills them. Even when Israel sinned, even when kings failed, God said, I will discipline them, but I will not abandon them. Correction is a sign of covenant, not a cancellation of it. And then God declared something astonishing. I will establish David's throne forever. This wasn't just about an earthly king. This pointed to the Messiah, the Son of David, Jesus Christ. The throne is eternal because Christ is eternal. God's covenant stands because Christ stands. The crisis of broken expectation, Psalm 89 verse 38 to 45. But suddenly, the tone shifts. It feels like we stepped into a different chapter. Because now, Israel is in pain. The kingdom is falling apart. The throne looks empty. The promises look impossible. Everything God said seems contradicted by reality. If you've ever felt like God's promises were failing, Psalm 89 understands you. The psalmist says, you have cast us off. He feels abandoned. He feels forgotten. He feels disappointed with God. And he says it honestly, raw, unfiltered, emotional. Let this sink in. The Bible gives you permission to bring your pain to God. Real faith is not pretending everything is okay. Real faith is running to God when nothing makes sense. Psalm 89 teaches us that confusion is not rebellion. Lament is not unbelief. Asking why does not disqualify your faith. God is big enough for your questions. The appeal to God's faithfulness, Psalm 89 verse 46 to 52 in the final section. The psalmist begins to pray not out of despair, but out of covenant. He says, Lord, how long? Not as a complaint, but as a reminder. You made a promise. You declared a covenant. You cannot fail. This is the turning point. The psalmist doesn't remind God, he reminds himself. He looks at the broken throne, the ruined nation, the silence from heaven, and he still ends with one word. Blessed be the Lord forever. He praises God even when he doesn't understand God. He trusts God even when he cannot trace God. He clings to covenant when circumstances contradict covenant. And that is faith. Christ, the fulfillment of the covenant, Psalm 89, ends unresolved. There's no miracle, no breakthrough, no answered prayer, no restoration. But that's because the story wasn't fulfilled in the Old Testament. It was fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the Son of David, who sits on the eternal throne. Jesus is the King whose kingdom never ends. Jesus is the proof that God keeps his promises even if the answer takes generations to manifest. God's covenant stands because Jesus rose from the dead. God's faithfulness stands because Christ sits on the throne today. No matter how dark your situation looks, the covenant is still alive because Christ is alive. Application, what this means for you. Psalm 89 teaches us three life-changing truths. 1. God's promises are stronger than your circumstances. What you see is temporary. What God said is eternal. 2. God may discipline you, but he will never abandon you. Correction is part of covenant love. 3. Even when there is no evidence, trust his covenant. Faith stands on the character of God, not the conditions of life. 4. Worship until clarity comes. Psalm 89 begins with worship and ends with worship because worship stabilizes the soul. A word of hope, I want you to hear this today. Your life may look like Psalm 89, broken, confusing, filled with questions, but your story will end with Christ's faithfulness. The covenant still stands. The promise still lives. God has not changed his mind about you. And what he started, he will finish.